"Broodmare," said Lady Cecily Ashworth, loud enough to carry across the full length of the breakfast table, "is perhaps generous. She has no breeding, no fortune, and no family name worth the paper it is printed on. What she has is a serviceable face and the sort of quiet disposition that men mistake for virtue." There was a pause of precisely the kind that precedes irrevocable things. The Duke of Ashworth set down his knife. He set it down slowly, without sound, in the way of a man who has decided something and is taking care not to make a performance of it. He looked at his sister, and what was in his expression was not anger. Anger would have been easier to survive, but something flatter and more absolute. "You will leave the table," he said. "You will leave this house before noon. When you have considered what you have said in front of a guest, I will receive a letter. I do not expect it will arrive quickly. Miss Eleanor Ashworth, no relation to the sister, only the unfortunate coincidence of a shared name that had caused confusion since Eleanor's first week in the household, sat 3 chairs away and did not move. She did not look at the door as Lady Cecily pushed back from the table. She did not look at the Duke. She picked up her cup of tea and took a careful sip, and then she set the cup back with the same precision she brought to everything: accounts, negotiations, the arrangement of 17 years' worth of problems that had never been hers to solve, and which she had solved regardless. She had been called worse. She had managed worse than being called worse. What she had not managed before was the moment afterward, the stillness that followed Cecily's departure, the creak of the house resettling, and the Duke of Ashworth's gaze moving to her with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize over the past 6 weeks. Not apology, not discomfort, but the precise, measuring look of a man who was watching to see whether she was all right without being willing to ask a question that would embarrass her by implying she needed to be. "The tenants on the north parcel sent a message before breakfast," Eleanor said, not because the tenants were urgent, but because the tenants were something she could say. "The roof on the easternmost cottage has deteriorated past what a standard seasonal repair can address. I've written to the builder in Hereford who handled the stables last spring. He gave a reliable figure then." The Duke looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked his knife back up and resumed his breakfast. "Send me the figure when it arrives," he said. Eleanor nodded and reached for her pen. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had been keeping this particular room standing for 43 days. The county of Herefordshire in the autumn of 1815 was a landscape of modest estates and considerable expectations, and Ashworth Manor occupied the higher ground at the valley's eastern edge with the particular confidence of a house that had never needed to announce its own importance. Its stone was the gray gold of old money, its gardens disciplined rather than fashionable, its interior maintained to a standard that no one who worked there could fully explain given the years it had spent without a proper household manager. The previous manager had left in March. The steward before him had lasted 11 months. The solicitor in Hereford, a man named Mr. Aldous Webb, who had managed the ducal estate's affairs for 19 years, had run out of suitable candidates from conventional sources and turned in some desperation to the less conventional. That was how Eleanor had come to be there. She had arrived on the 15th of September with a single trunk and a letter of reference from her late father's solicitor, who had written that she possessed organizational abilities of the first order and an understanding of agricultural accounts that exceeded what most men trained to the work could claim. Mr. Webb had read the letter 3 times before interviewing her. The interview had lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, he had offered her the position of household and estate administrator, not a title that had existed before, and not one that appeared in any letter of appointment, because Mr. Webb was still working out how to explain it to the Duke. He had explained it, eventually. The Duke had said nothing, asked 3 questions, and given his assent. Eleanor had found out later, from the maid who unpacked her trunk and seemed to treat information as a natural form of hospitality, that the Duke had not given assent easily to anything in the 3 years since his mother died. She had filed this information in the same place she filed everything useful, and returned to the inventory she was already composing in her head. The life that had produced Eleanor Voss. She had been Eleanor Voss for 28 years before she became, by the ambiguous grace of the Duke's household, simply Eleanor, was not a life anyone would have chosen. Her father, a competent country solicitor in Worcestershire, had died when she was 14, leaving an estate that looked stable from the outside and was, from the inside, a construction of deferred payments and unrealized hopes. Her uncle had arrived within the week. He was a man who understood money primarily as something other people managed on his behalf, and he had settled Eleanor's future in the space of a single afternoon by informing her that she would maintain the household accounts in exchange for her room and board, until such time as a suitable situation presented itself. The suitable situation had not presented itself for 14 years. What had presented itself instead was 14 years of accounts. Her uncle's estate, his rental properties in 3 neighboring parishes, the wool merchant business he had acquired in 1805 and run into debt by 1808, and the long, slow work of recovery that Eleanor had managed by renegotiating terms with creditors her uncle refused to meet personally, and redirecting income from the stronger properties to cover the deficits of the weaker ones. She had never been thanked for this. She had not expected to be thanked. What she had learned instead was the precise texture of agricultural ledgers, the difference between a creditor who would extend terms and one who would not, the specific language required to make a tenant believe that the person writing to them had authority, and the specific language required to make an investor believe the same thing, and the difference between the two, which was mostly a matter of which words sat in which order. She had also learned, at 21, in a winter that was colder than any she had known before or since, that she was not going to become less than she was. It had been an ordinary Tuesday. Her uncle had brought home a letter of proposal from a man 20 years Eleanor's senior who had looked at the household accounts and identified in her the quality of a woman who could manage his affairs without requiring to be paid for it. Her uncle had presented this as good news. Eleanor had read the letter twice. She had set it on the table, picked up her pen, and returned to the wool merchant reconciliation she had been halfway through when her uncle arrived. She had not said anything because there was nothing yet to say, but something had settled in her chest like a keystone fitting into place, and what it had settled into was a decision. She was not going to be arranged into a purpose someone else had chosen for her. She was going to work until she had earned a choice. It had taken 7 more years. It had involved 3 additional creditor negotiations, 1 near catastrophic harvest on the northern property, the discovery of a fraudulent contract in the wool merchant accounts that she had quietly neutralized by producing a counter-document the original signatory could not dispute without exposing himself, and the eventual, reluctant acknowledgement from Mr. Webb, who had handled her uncle's affairs on the Worcestershire side and watched her work from a professional distance, that she was the most operationally capable individual he had encountered in a career spanning 3 decades. It was Mr. Webb who had offered her the Ashworth position. She had considered it for 1 evening. Then she had packed her trunk. The first time she had been seen, genuinely seen, in the way that mattered, was the afternoon she was 17, and her father sat in his chair by the window and watched her balance 3 sets of quarterly accounts simultaneously, without a single reference to her working notes. He had not said anything for a long time. Then he had said, in the voice of a man choosing his words carefully because he understood their weight, "Eleanor, the world is going to try to make smaller use of you than it ought. I am sorry I cannot prevent that. What I can tell you is that you are capable of refusing to cooperate with it." He had died 6 months later. She had carried those words for 14 years like a bearing wall carries a roof, without drama, but without them nothing stood. Mr. Webb had found her working at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, which was when she had been working for the previous 11 years, and she had arrived at Ashworth Manor at 7 in the morning on the 15th of September, which was when she intended to continue working. The household had observed this with the particular silence of people who did not yet know what to make of her. The maid who had unpacked her trunk was named Clara, and Clara had decided what to make of her within 48 hours, which was faster than anyone in Eleanor's professional experience had managed. Clara was 23, practical in the specific way of women who have been managing larger households than their position suggested since they were 15. And she brought Eleanor her tea in the morning without being asked, and without a look that implied the gesture was remarkable. The first morning, she had set the tea down beside the open ledger and said, "The under-gardener has been entering his hours before he works them. I noticed because the entries are in a different ink. I thought you should know." Eleanor had looked at her. "How long?" "Since March. About 4 months before that, the last manager left." He might have known. Eleanor had closed the ledger and opened it to the gardening accounts. The discrepancy was 11 shillings across 6 months. Not catastrophic, but she had written a note in the margin and addressed the matter with the under-gardener by Thursday, quietly, without dismissal, with the kind of precision that made clear she would be watching, and that watching was something she was exceptionally good at. The under-gardener had not tried it again. Clara had brought the tea every morning since. It was in this way, tea, ledger, discrepancy, solution, that Eleanor had established herself at Ashworth Manor before the Duke arrived in October. James Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ashworth, had last been at Ashworth Manor in the spring of 3 years ago, for his mother's funeral. He had managed the estate from London in the interval, through a sequence of stewards and managers who had not lasted, and solicitors who had tried to fill the gaps. The house had felt it, not visibly, not in the stonework or the grounds, which were maintained by habit, but in the internal operations, the accounts that were organized but not intelligently organized, the supply contracts that were not renegotiated when better terms became available, the tenant correspondence that was answered, but never with the specificity that turned a response into an actual solution. He had known something was wrong with how the estate was being managed. He had not known the extent of it until Mr. Webb had sent him Eleanor's first month of work as evidence of what a proper administrator could do. He had read the accounts on a Tuesday evening in London, standing at his desk without sitting down, which was something he did only when a document held his attention so completely that the chair felt like an interruption. The accounts were not merely organized. They were the work of someone who understood an estate the way a structural engineer understands a building, who could identify where the load was being carried, which points were under stress, which repairs were cosmetic, and which were foundational. She had flagged 17 items in the first month. 9 of them she had already resolved. The other 8 had recommendations attached, with specific cost figures and specific contractors, and a note at the bottom of the page that read, in a hand that was precise without being decorative, "These 8 items are ordered by urgency. The first 3 require your approval before I can proceed. I have attached the supporting correspondence." He had gone to Ashworth in October. He had known, in the way he had been trained to know things about useful people, what her situation was before he arrived. Mr. Webb had given him the outline, the uncle's household, the 14 years of unpaid management, the wool merchant recovery, the fraudulent contract she had quietly unmade. He had read the account without saying anything. He had thought about it on the long road from London, in the particular way he thought about things that mattered, methodically, without rushing to a conclusion. She was not what he had expected. He was not certain what he had expected. A capable woman, certainly. The accounts had told him that much. But capability in accounts did not fully explain what he found when he arrived. The quality of the household, the way the staff moved with quiet purpose rather than the anxious performance of people trying to look industrious. The tenants who wrote with their specific problems clearly articulated because they had learned that the administrator would respond to specific articulation. The first thing she said to him when he walked through the door of the estate office, which was not a greeting but an observation. "The southern fence line has been missurveyed," she had said, without looking up immediately from the map she was consulting. "Someone moved the marker posts in 1803. I found it in the records. It means the Thornfield tenant has been paying rent on land that isn't his to rent, and the Crowley family has been using land they technically own without the legal documentation to confirm it. It wants a surveyor and a solicitor, in that order." He had stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he had sat down across from her and said, "Show me." She had shown him. It had taken 40 minutes. By the end of those 40 minutes, he had understood 3 things: that the estate had been hemorrhaging money in small, invisible ways for at least a decade, that she had found most of the bleeding in the first 6 weeks, and that she spoke about a problem the way a physician speaks about a diagnosis, without catastrophe, with precision, with a clear sense of what came next. He had gone to find Mr. Webb and asked him, without preamble, how it was that no one had placed Miss Voss in a position commensurate with her abilities before now. Mr. Webb had looked at him over the top of his spectacles for a long moment. "She is a woman of no title, no family connection, and no property," he had said. "The relevant positions do not advertise for that." He had returned to the estate office. She had been there when he came back. She was always there. He had not been at Ashworth since his mother died, and the house had felt, in the interval, like something behind glass, present but unreachable, more memory than home. He had managed it from a distance because being present in it was a different kind of task, the kind that required something from him he had not been sure he still had. His mother had loved this house in the active, specific way of someone for whom it was not a property, but a living thing. She had known every tenant by name, every family, every child's birth year. She had kept records not because she was required to, but because she considered it part of being here properly, and the records were in the library in 17 neat volumes, and James had not opened any of them since the spring of 3 years ago. Eleanor had found the volumes in the 2nd week. He had not known this until the 4th week, when she had flagged a tenant's name in correspondence and added a note. "The family also appears in the household history maintained by the previous chatelaine. The record suggests an agreement regarding their son's apprenticeship. I believe this may bear on the current situation. I have not opened the relevant volume without your approval." He had read that sentence 3 times. He had gone to the library that evening after dinner, when the house was quiet, and taken down the volume for 1810, and read his mother's handwriting for the first time in 3 years, without the protective numbness that grief provides when it is still fresh. It had not been easy, but it had been possible, and the possibility was something he had not known he still had. He had not told Eleanor any of this, but he had stopped outside the music room on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week, because he had heard something through the closed door that he recognized, his mother's composition, the one she had written for herself and never performed, the one he had assumed no one else knew. He had stood there for a long time without going in, one hand resting against the doorframe, and he had listened to Eleanor play it through to its ending with the unhurried accuracy of someone who had found the music in the bench and learned it because it was there and worth learning. He had stood there for the 3rd night before she knew he was listening. Lady Cecily had arrived in the 4th week. Cecily Ashworth was 26, beautiful in the way of women who have always known they are beautiful and have constructed a personality accordingly, and she had arrived with 2 maids, a quantity of luggage, and a set of opinions about Ashworth Manor's new administrative arrangement that she had not been asked for, and chose to offer anyway. She had taken an immediate and specific dislike to Eleanor, which Eleanor recognized as structural rather than personal. Cecily had expected, and had told several people she expected, that James would propose to Miss Adeline Hartley of Hartley Park before the year was out. Miss Adeline Hartley was the daughter of a viscount, possessed of beauty, fortune, and the kind of graceful social management that made rooms run smoothly. She was precisely what a duke was supposed to choose. Cecily had been preparing for her future sister-in-law's arrival for the better part of 2 years. Eleanor was not Miss Adeline Hartley. What Eleanor was, in Cecily's assessment, was an interloper of indeterminate class who had installed herself at a desk in the estate office and appeared to have the Duke's attention to a degree that Cecily found alarming and incomprehensible in equal measure. She had spent 4 weeks finding increasingly pointed ways to make Eleanor aware of her unsuitability, none of which Eleanor had responded to with anything except precision. When Cecily had asked, at a dinner that included 3 county neighbors, what exactly Eleanor's position was, with an inflection that made the question mean something other than what the words said, Eleanor had replied that she was the estate administrator and was happy to explain the duties involved to anyone who was curious. When Cecily had mentioned, within Eleanor's clear hearing, that James had always admired intelligent women but did not necessarily require intelligence in a wife, Eleanor had looked up from the letter she was writing, completed the sentence she was in the middle of, and then looked at Cecily with the particular expression of someone who has filed the information and will address it later, at the time and in the manner of their own choosing. She had been called worse. What Cecily offered was in fact considerably less than worse. But it accumulated, as these things do, and the morning at breakfast, when Cecily had reached the word Broodmare, something in Eleanor had gone very still in the way of a person taking inventory of their own limits and finding the number clear. She had not responded. She had not needed to. The Duke had set down his knife. There was a woman named Miss Patience Fellows who came to dine at Ashworth on a Thursday evening in the 5th week, brought by the county physician whose wife was her cousin, and who looked at Eleanor across the table with the frank, direct attention of someone who does not bother with social preliminary. She was 31, recently returned from 2 years in Edinburgh where her husband had been a lecturer in natural philosophy before his death, and she wore the slight, permanent impatience of a woman who has been in rooms full of intelligent people and returned to find the local conversation several steps slower than she required. "You organized the supply contracts for this estate?" she said to Eleanor, in the middle of a discussion about wool prices that the physician was conducting with the Duke. "In the first 3 weeks," Eleanor said. "And the tenant survey that Mr. Webb mentioned at the Hargreaves dinner last week, the boundary correction, that was yours?" "It is proceeding. The surveyor is coming next Thursday." Patience Fellows looked at her steadily. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" 14 years. "And before Ashworth, my uncle's estate in Worcestershire, and a wool merchant operation that needed restructuring." Patience said nothing for a moment. She reached for her wine glass, and what was in her expression was not the assessing coolness of someone deciding whether Eleanor was worth knowing, but the specific recognition of someone who understood the shape of 14 years of invisible competence because she had her own version of the same story. "I intend to call on Thursday morning," she said, "if you are available." Eleanor had been available. Patience had arrived at 11 with 2 books and a set of opinions about estate reform that were better informed than those of most men Eleanor had encountered professionally, and they had talked through the morning and into the luncheon hour without noticing the time. The Duke, passing through the entrance hall on his way to meet the surveyor, had observed this through the open door of the morning room, with an expression Eleanor did not see and could not have read if she had, because it was the expression of a man who was watching something he had hoped for, without permitting himself to name the hope. The surveyor arrived Thursday and confirmed what Eleanor's reading of the 1803 records had suggested. The Thornfield boundary markers had been moved, not accidentally, and the legal correction required a formal document, executed by both families, and witnessed by a solicitor. Mr. Webb came out from Hereford the following Monday. The document took 4 hours to prepare and 3 signatures to execute. The tenant, who had been paying rent on incorrectly surveyed land, sat in the estate office afterward and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has been told something he had known was wrong for 12 years and had never believed anyone would bother to fix. "My father wrote to the previous manager about this in 1807, he said, "and in 1809. I found those letters," Eleanor said. "They are in the file." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put on his hat and left, and Eleanor returned to the accounts, and that was the whole of the conversation. But she felt it afterward in the way she felt most of the work, not triumphantly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a stone placed correctly in a wall. It was in the library, on an evening in the 6th week, that the Duke found her at 11 at night, with the household history volumes spread across the reading table, cross-referencing her current tenant files against his mother's records. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up, and she did not start, which he noticed, because most people startled when he appeared unexpectedly in doorways, and she simply looked at him with the same steady attention she gave everything. "You are using her records," he said. "They are the most complete record of the estate's social obligations I have found. The formal accounts tell me what was spent. Her volumes tell me why, and to whom, and under what circumstances." She paused. "I should have asked before I opened them. I apologize for that." He came into the library. He did not sit. He stood on the other side of the reading table and looked at the open volume, and Eleanor watched him look at it with the particular attention of someone reading a person's face the way she read accounts, for what was actually there rather than what was being presented. "She would have given you permission," he said finally. "She would have found you and given you the volumes herself, and then she would have sat there for 2 hours asking you questions." He touched the edge of the open page with one finger, not quite the text, the margin beside it. "She organized them herself. 19 years. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "It is very good work." He looked up from the page. She did not look away. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was more like the moment when 2 weights are placed on a balance and the beam settles, not dramatically, but with the inevitability of physics. "The surveyor's report," he said after a moment. "On your desk before breakfast. The builder in Hereford. He gave a figure of £38 for the North Parcel cottage. I have compared it with his previous work and with 2 other estimates. It is reasonable. I have drafted an instruction, if you want to review it." He looked at her, not the measuring look of the first days, but something quieter, something that had settled into a different register altogether. "You have been here 6 weeks, he said. 43 days, she said. "The builder's estimate was the 41st item I have addressed." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, but the particular quality of attention that is its own form of warmth. "Go to bed, Miss Voss," he said. "The 42nd item will be there tomorrow." She gathered her papers with the unhurried precision that characterized everything she did. At the doorway she paused, not looking back at him, but addressing the room generally in the way she sometimes did when she had a thought that she was still organizing. "Your cravat has been crooked since dinner," she said. "Approximately 40 minutes." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, but the sound of a man who has been surprised into something resembling one. She went to bed. The morning that had been Cecily's last in the house was the morning that everything else became visible. It was not only that Cecily had gone, it was that in the quiet that followed her departure, the arrangement that had been building in the house over 6 weeks settled into its actual shape, and the actual shape was visible to everyone who had not already been seeing it. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper who had managed Ashworth in her own quiet way for 17 years and who had initially regarded Eleanor's arrival with the careful neutrality of an experienced professional watching new management, brought Eleanor her morning ledger on the day after Cecily's dismissal, and said, without any particular preamble, "I told Mr. Webb in March that what was needed was someone who understood the difference between running a house and understanding it. I'm glad he listened." Eleanor received this in the spirit in which it was given. "I could not do any of it without what you already had in order," she said, which was true, and which Mrs. Aldridge accepted with the same directness that she offered everything. But the shape of things was visible to others as well. Lord William Ashworth, the Duke's father, arrived on the 22nd of October. He was 67, a man of considerable presence in the way of men who have spent 50 years being the most important person in every room they entered, and he had made the journey from his estate in Shropshire with the specific purpose of determining, as he put it in the letter that preceded him by 2 days, whether the arrangements at Ashworth were proceeding as they ought. Eleanor had read the letter. She understood what it meant. Someone had written to him. It was not difficult to guess who. Lord William conducted his assessment of the estate over 3 days with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to finding things wrong, and the particular kind of patience that is actually impatience in a more controlled costume. On the first day he reviewed the estate accounts with Mr. Webb. On the second day he visited the tenants, the physician's household, the Thornfield family, the Crowley farm, and returned in the late afternoon with an expression that Eleanor could not read from where she stood at the estate office window, watching his arrival from a distance. On the third day he requested a meeting. She had been expecting this. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for creditor negotiations, not with arguments but with documents. The relevant files were organized and labeled. The figures were verified. The 41 completed items were listed with dates and outcomes. The 8 items pending the Duke's approval were listed with their recommendations and supporting correspondence attached. The boundary correction was documented in full, with the solicitor's executed copies included. Lord William arrived at 10 in the morning. He sat down across from her without accepting the chair she indicated, which was the one with the better light for reading the documents she had prepared, and chose instead the one from which he could observe her across the full width of the desk. Eleanor noted this and made no comment on it. "You are Miss Voss," he said. "Yes, your lordship. Mr. Webb speaks highly of your capabilities. Mr. Webb is generous. He is not, as a matter of fact, a generous man in his assessments. That is what makes his assessment in your case interesting." He looked at her steadily. "You understand that what is occurring here is a matter of some concern to me." Eleanor folded her hands on the desk, on top of the prepared files, and looked at him with the direct attentiveness of someone who is not going to pretend she does not understand what he means. "I believe you are concerned," she said, "that I have obtained a position of influence in your son's household, and that my circumstances, no title, no property, no family connection, make that influence inappropriate." "I am concerned," Lord William said carefully, "that my son appears to have developed an attachment that will cost him socially and professionally if it is not addressed before it becomes a matter of public record." "With respect," Eleanor said, "your son has not expressed an attachment to me." "Eleanor." He used her given name with the particular deliberateness of a man indicating that the formal courtesies were over. "I have been in this world for 67 years. I know what I see." She held his gaze. She did not permit herself to look at the window or the door or anywhere that was not directly at him, because to look away would have been to concede something she was not prepared to concede. "What I can tell you," she said, "is what I have done here. I can show it to you." She set her hand on the files. 41 items in 43 days. The boundary correction will save the estate a legal dispute that would have run to £300 and 3 years of uncertain outcome. The supply contract renegotiation recovered 400 annually in margin that was being left on the table. The builder's estimate on the north parcel is £38 against a structural deterioration that would have cost 200 in 5 years. I have also found and corrected 2 instances of accounts manipulation that were minor, individually, and would have been significant if they had continued. Lord William looked at the files without moving to open them. I am not arguing, Eleanor continued, that the situation is uncomplicated. I am telling you what the situation actually is, as opposed to what the situation might appear to be through a particular frame. I am here because this estate needed someone to manage it properly, and I am able to do that. Nothing else has occurred. A silence settled. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. Miss Adeline Hartley, Lord William said finally, is an excellent woman. I have no doubt of it, Eleanor said. I have not met her. She would be a suitable match by every applicable measure. I have not disputed that. He looked at her again, with the particular expression of a man confronting a response that is entirely reasonable and which he suspects he cannot refute. He reached out, slowly, and opened the top file. He looked at the first page, then he turned to the second. He was quiet for a long time. When he closed the file, his expression had not changed in any way that could be called visible, but something in the way he sat had shifted by a fraction, a subtle resettlement, like a building taking on new information about where its load was bearing. My son has not made his intentions plain to you, he said. He has not. He stood. He did not thank her for the meeting, which she did not expect, and he did not apologize for the implication of his concerns, which she also did not expect. But at the door he stopped, and he stood there for a moment with his back to her, and when he spoke, his voice was a tone quieter than it had been throughout the meeting. My late daughter-in-law, James's mother, ran this estate for 22 years, he said. She ran it with the same precision you have described to me, and did not receive credit for most of it in any formal record. I noted it at the time. I did not say so at the time. A pause. I am saying so now. He left. Eleanor sat for a moment with her hands still on the files, and then she straightened her spine, picked up her pen, and continued. The formal gathering at Ashworth Manor on the 3rd of November was Lord William's idea, which was the detail that made it something other than a private family matter. He had, it emerged, spent the fortnight between his visit and the gathering writing letters to 4 members of the County Investment Consortium that held the primary agricultural development contracts for the Herefordshire estates. The consortium had been attempting, since the summer, to renegotiate the terms of 3 Ashworth agricultural agreements in ways that were technically legal and substantively unfavorable, and which had been proceeding largely because no one at Ashworth had been paying attention. Eleanor had been paying attention since the 3rd week. She had identified the problem in the 2nd month's accounts review. The consortium's proposed revisions would shift 60% of the weather-related crop liability from the consortium to the estate, without a corresponding adjustment in revenue share, a change buried in 17 pages of contract language that she had read at 2 in the morning, with the particular focus she brought to documents that felt wrong before she could articulate why. She had made notes in the margins of her working copy. She had written a counter-analysis. She had requested, through Mr. Webb, a meeting with the consortium. The consortium had agreed to a meeting at Ashworth on the 3rd of November. What they had not agreed to, and did not know, was that Lord William Ashworth had written to the 4 senior members and indicated that the Duke of Ashworth would be present, and that the meeting would be conducted with the full documentation of the estate's position. The consortium's representative, a man named Mr. Grayson Holt, arrived expecting a routine administrative discussion. He arrived to find the drawing room configured as a formal meeting chamber, 4 of the consortium's own senior investors already seated, the Duke at the head of the table, Mr. Webb at his right, and Eleanor at the far end with a stack of annotated documents that was, by conservative estimate, 4 inches tall. Patience Fellows was in the hall. She was not part of the meeting. She had come because Eleanor had mentioned it the previous Thursday, and because Patience was constitutionally incapable of missing a situation that struck her as historically interesting. Lord William was seated against the wall, to the right of the door. He had no formal role in the proceedings. His presence was the most precisely calibrated element of the entire arrangement. Eleanor had managed creditor negotiations. She had managed solicitors and builders and surveyors and agricultural merchants. What she had not done was stand, literally stand, before a room of 7 men and present a counter-analysis of a contract renegotiation, with the Duke watching from the head of the table and the senior investors watching with the careful attention of men who were beginning to understand that something unusual was about to happen. She stood up. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply stood, and the room recognized the posture of someone who had something to present that required everyone's full attention. The proposed revisions to Agreements 14, 22, and 29 of the Ashworth Agricultural Consortium contracts, she said, transfer weather-related crop liability to the estate without adjustment to revenue share in Sections 7, 11, and 14 of each respective document. The aggregate effect over a standard 5-year contract period, assuming average seasonal variance, is a net loss to the estate of between £300 and £420 annually. I have calculated this against the meteorological records for this county for the past 15 years. The supporting figures are in the documents I am passing to each of you now. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform conviction. She passed the documents down the table with the same calm she brought to everything, and the room read them in the particular silence of people who have been told something they cannot immediately dispute. Mr. Holt looked up. He was a man of about 50, experienced in negotiations, and what crossed his face was not the expression of someone confronting a fraud. It was the expression of someone confronting the realization that they had been moving a piece on a board they had not expected anyone else to have studied. "Miss Voss," he said, deploying her name in the particular way of men who use names as instruments of minor authority. "The contract language is standard." "It is standard language from a different contract context," Eleanor said. "It appears in the wool consortium agreements for Yorkshire, where the weather liability distribution is appropriate to the geographic risk profile. It is not appropriate to Herefordshire's profile, which I have documented in Appendix 3. One of the senior investors turned to Appendix 3. "The original Ashworth agreements," Eleanor continued, "are among the materials I have provided. The specific variance from the original terms is marked in the margin of each page. 29 of the 37 clauses being proposed are consistent with the original. The 8 that are not are highlighted." The room was quiet for a moment. The senior investor who had turned to Appendix 3 looked up at Mr. Holt with an expression that was not quite inquiry. Mr. Holt said, "This level of analysis is accurate," said the senior investor. His name was Mr. Jonathan Sewell, and he was 62 years old and had been reviewing agricultural contracts for 30 years, and the word he said was the only word he needed to say because it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward from it in all directions. Eleanor waited. The Duke had not spoken since she stood up. He had watched her. She was aware of this without looking at him, aware of it the way you are aware of a lamp in a room, not looking directly at it, but navigating by its light. "What does the estate require?" said Mr. Sewell. "The original liability distribution, restored in sections 7, 11, and 14, Eleanor said, and a seasonal variance review clause added to each agreement, executed every 3 years, which protects both parties from the accumulated effect of climate changes over the contract period. I have drafted that clause. It is on the final page of the packet." Mr. Sewell turned to the final page. He read the clause. He passed it to the investor beside him. Mr. Holt had not moved for several seconds. He was a man who was recalibrating, and the recalibration was not a swift process. We would require time to review, he said. Of course, Eleanor said. The estate's position is documented. Mr. Webb will coordinate the next meeting. She sat down. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which 7 men understood in various ways and at various speeds that they had come to a meeting with one set of assumptions and were leaving with a different one, and the difference was the result of 6 weeks of work by a woman who had read 17 pages of contract language at 2 in the morning because something had felt wrong. The Duke stood. He did not do it for ceremony. He stood because she had stood, and because what she had done in that room required a witness who was willing to be visible. Miss Voss's analysis represents the estate's position, he said. The documentation she has provided is the basis on which all further discussion will proceed. He looked at Mr. Holt and then at each of the senior investors in turn, and the look was not threatening and not apologetic. It was simply the measured attention of a man who has decided something and is making the decision legible. We will meet again in a fortnight. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at her with the full weight of whatever it was that had been building in the library and the music room and the garden path and the 43 days of shared work, and what was in his expression was not the social performance of approval, but something that was older and quieter and more absolute than approval. It was recognition, the same recognition she had carried in her chest since the day her father told her to refuse to cooperate with being made smaller, the thing she had been working toward for 14 years without knowing its exact shape. The room understood something before it could articulate it. Lord William Ashworth stood up from his chair against the wall. He walked to where Eleanor sat, and he extended his hand, and she looked at it for one clear moment before she stood and took it. "My son," he said, "appears to have the judgment I once thought he had." He held her hand for one beat, which was all the ceremony the moment required, and then he released it and walked past her toward the door, and the room was irreversibly changed. Patience was in the corridor. When Eleanor came through the door, Patience looked at her with the expression of someone who has witnessed something they knew was going to be significant and will be thinking about it for weeks. "Well," said Patience, "good." Eleanor had managed 14 years of accounts and 3 creditor negotiations and a fraudulent contract and 41 estate items in 43 days. She could manage the feeling in her chest that was neither triumph nor relief, but something that sat between them, in the quiet place where an old decision finally meets its outcome. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. The Duke found her in the garden that evening, on the path that ran behind the kitchen garden and along the south wall, where the last of the October roses had not entirely surrendered. She was not walking for pleasure. She was walking because she had been sitting in the estate office for 9 hours, and she was capable of recognizing when her mind had run to the end of what it could usefully process, and walking was the mechanism she used to let it catch up. He came along the path from the other direction, and they met at the place where the path turned, and he stopped. He was not wearing his coat. He had been at his desk when he came out. She could tell by the state of his cravat, which was crooked again, which she noted and chose to leave, this once, in the quiet solidarity of a decision made deliberately. "The packet you prepared for the consortium," he said. "Mr. Webb told me you had begun it in the 3rd week." "The 4th day," she said. "I identified the pattern in the 4th day's reading. It took 3 weeks to have the full analysis prepared." He looked at her without the measuring quality of the early weeks, because there was nothing left to measure. Whatever calculation he had been making since October had reached its conclusion, and the conclusion was not a surprise to either of them. "Mr. Sewell wrote to Mr. Webb before dinner," he said. "The consortium will accept the original liability terms. They are requesting a meeting to discuss the seasonal variance clause as a permanent addition to all consortium agreements across the county. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. This was larger than she had projected. The seasonal variance clause had been drafted for Ashworth. If it was adopted across the county, it would change the economic terms for 30 estates and the income security for several hundred tenants. "That is good news," she said. "It is your clause," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the last light of a November evening with the rose wall behind him, and what she saw in him, the contained precision, the stillness, the way he was watching her with everything he actually had, rather than what he was socially permitted to offer, was the shape of a person she recognized. He had listened outside a closed door for 3 nights. He had stood up when she stood. He had come to find her in the garden in November without his coat because he had not been willing to wait until morning. "Miss Voss," he said. The words came carefully, with the deliberateness of a man choosing each one. "I recognize that the position in which I am about to place you is one you did not ask for, and that the asking will require you to consider something that has no precedent in this household or this county, and I am asking it regardless, because I am not willing to allow the correct moment to pass by in deference to a convenience that was never yours to begin with." She held very still. The garden was quiet. Somewhere behind the wall, a bird was making small, insistent sounds in the rose canes. "I am asking," he said, "if you would consider becoming my wife." He held her gaze. He did not move. She thought about it. She thought about it fully, the way she thought about every material decision, not from the accelerated angle of hope or fear, but from the complete surveyed landscape of what it actually was, and what it would actually mean. She thought about 14 years, and the ledger, and the music room, and the library at midnight, and the crooked cravat, and the way he had looked at her across a room full of men who were being asked to reconsider what they thought they knew. She thought about the garden and the rose wall and the fact that he was here, without his coat, in November, and had not waited. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and direct and complete, and she meant every weight of it. He reached across the short distance between them and took her hand, her ungloved hand which she had not thought to cover when she came out, and he held it, and the warmth of that held against the cold November air was a specific and unrepeatable thing. "There is a public form," he said. "The announcement, the occasion, all of it managed through the appropriate channels." "I am aware," she said. "And then there is this," he said, "which is separate, and which I wanted to have first, because the other version is for other people." He looked at her steadily. "This one is not because it is convenient, or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes. It is because you went to find the thing that was wrong in those 17 pages at 2 in the morning, and because you have been keeping this house standing for 43 days, and because you played my mother's composition without being asked to, and because you told me my cravat was crooked for 40 minutes, and then left me to manage it myself. That is the particular kind of person I have been looking for since I understood what it meant to look." She pressed his hand once. "It has been 44 minutes, she said, "this time." He looked at her with the expression of a man who is not going to be capable of pretending he is not happy, which was an expression she had not seen on him before, and which was, she thought, entirely correct on him. "I will address it," he said. "You will not," she said. "I will." She reached up and straightened his cravat with the same decisive efficiency she brought to every other material in the world, and when her hands stilled, they were very close, and the November garden was quiet, and the choice between them was entirely, irreversibly made. They were married in December, in the church in the village at the bottom of the valley, in a ceremony that was attended by every tenant family on the Ashworth estate, because Eleanor had written to each of them personally in the week before the wedding, not as a social obligation but because they were the families in the volumes, and they were the reason any of it was worth doing properly. Patience Fellows was there in the third pew, wearing an expression of fierce and unsentimental satisfaction. Mr. Webb stood beside Lord William in the north aisle, and Lord William's expression was not warm and not easy, but it was present, and it was without the opposition that had been in it 6 weeks ago, and Eleanor counted that as enough. Adeline Hartley was not at the wedding. She had returned to Hartley Park in October with the information that the Duke's household had been reorganized in ways that precluded the match her family had anticipated, and she had received this information with the grace of a woman who had always understood that some outcomes are determined by factors outside the social mathematics one is raised to calculate. She was engaged by March to the second son of a Derbyshire earl. The marriage was considered suitable by every applicable measure, Cecily had written. The letter had arrived in November, after the consortium meeting, and it was not warm and it was not easy, but it contained an acknowledgment that Eleanor received in good faith and placed in a drawer, which was all the acknowledgment required. The life they built was particular in the way of lives built by people who approach every problem with specificity. The seasonal variance clause that Eleanor had drafted in the Ashworth Library at 2 a.m. was formally adopted by the County Agricultural Consortium in March of the following year, applied across 26 Herefordshire estates, and affecting the income security of 314 tenant families. Mr. Webb had it entered into the county records. He sent Eleanor a copy of the entry with a note in his precise, unornamented hand that read only, "This will be referenced for some years." It was. Eleanor continued as estate administrator for 18 months after the wedding, because the work was not finished and it was her work, and she was not going to leave it unfinished. The accounts she organized, annotated, and cross-referenced with the previous chatelaines' household histories became the model that 4 neighboring estates eventually adopted, not because Eleanor promoted them, but because word of the boundary correction and the consortium clause traveled along the specific channels by which practical information travels in agricultural counties, and other estate managers came to look at the method and came away with something they could use. The son was born in October of 1817, on a morning of clear, cold light, and they named him Thomas, after Eleanor's father. He had the Duke's height in his very first weeks, in a way that made the physician laugh, and his mother's precision, which manifested early as the habit of studying faces with the systematic attention of someone who was working something out. He escaped from his crib at 11 months and was found in the estate office sitting on the floor with an overturned ink pot and the expression of a person who had conducted an experiment and was assessing the results. Eleanor had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had looked at her husband, who was behind her in the doorway, and what was on his face was something she could have read from across the county. The specific, complete warmth of a man watching 2 people he loves, in the room where it started, on a morning in October. She picked Thomas up. She handed him, ink-stained and satisfied, to his father. "He will need to be kept away from the accounts until he can read them," she said. "That was not a long time for you," the Duke said. "No," she said, "it was not." She went to the desk. She picked up her pen. The morning was clear, the house was warm, the ledger was open, and everything she had built was present in the room behind her. The child, the man, the work, the life that had been hers all along, waiting for the world to stop looking the other way. She settled in her chair and returned to the accounts, and James Ashworth stood in the doorway of the estate office with their ink-stained son on his arm, and watched her work with the unhurried, absolute attention of a man who intends to do exactly this for the rest of his life. And she knew he was watching, and she did not look up, and the room was full of everything that had been earned.